The Persians burned Athens to the ground in 480 BCE. They destroyed the temples, the homes, the early monuments on the Acropolis. They left a city of ash and rubble. Within 50 years, Athens had rebuilt itself into the most remarkable city in human history. The Parthenon, the sculptures of Phidias, the plays of Sophocles and Euripides, the philosophy of Socrates, the history of Thucydides, the political vision of Pericles, all of it produced in roughly half a century in a city of maybe 300,000 people on a rocky peninsula at the edge of the Mediterranean. No civilization before or since has produced so much that still matters, in so short a time, in so small a place. But here is what nobody mentions when they talk about the golden age of Athens. It was built on an empire. It was paid for by allies who didn't have much choice. And it ended in one of the most catastrophic, self-inflicted disasters in ancient history. The Golden Age of Athens is a story about genius and hubris in equal measure, and it starts with a man who may have been the greatest politician the ancient world ever produced. This is the Golden Age of Athens. Pericles dominated Athenian politics for nearly 30 years, from roughly 461 to 429 BCE. He was elected strategos, general, repeatedly year after year because the Athenians kept voting for him. In a democracy, that's how you hold power. You persuade people, and Pericles was extraordinarily good at persuasion. Ancient sources describe him as a brilliant orator, a careful strategist, and a man of almost austere personal integrity in an era when Athenian politicians regularly helped themselves to public funds. He lived modestly, avoided lavish parties, and spent his energy on the city rather than on personal enrichment. He also had a clear vision for what Athens should be, not just the most powerful city in Greece, but the most beautiful, the most cultured, and the most worthy of the empire it was building. After the Persian Wars, Athens had organized a defensive alliance called the Delian League, a coalition of Greek city-states that pooled resources to defend against future Persian aggression. Member states paid tribute into a common treasury, originally kept on the island of Delos. In 454 BCE, Pericles moved the treasury to Athens. He then did something that the other league members found extremely upsetting. He started spending their money on Athens. The Parthenon, the Propylaea, the Erechtheion, the statue of Athena Promachos, the massive building program that transformed the Acropolis into one of the wonders of the ancient world, was funded substantially by tribute paid by Athens' allies for defense against Persia. When the allies complained, Pericles essentially told them that as long as Athens was providing the defense, how Athens spent the surplus was Athens' business. It was politically audacious, arguably corrupt, and produced some of the most beautiful architecture in human history. Pericles was not a simple man, but here's something about the Parthenon that almost nobody mentions, something that changes how you see the entire building. It has no straight lines, not a single one. Every surface you think is flat is actually subtly curved, and the reason why reveals something extraordinary about how the Greeks thought about beauty and human perception. The Parthenon was built between 447 and 432 BCE under the direction of the sculptor Phidias, who also designed the legendary 40-foot gold and ivory statue of Athena that stood inside it. The architects were Ictinus and Callicrates, and what they built was not a simple temple. It was a precisely engineered optical illusion designed to look perfect to the human eye. The columns are not straight cylinders. They bulge slightly in the middle, a technique called entasis, because perfectly straight columns appear to the human eye to curve inward, looking thin and weak. The slight outward bulge corrects for this optical illusion and makes the columns look straight. The floor of the Parthenon curves upward very slightly toward the center. A perfectly flat floor looks like it sags. The slight curve makes it look level. The columns lean very slightly inward. If you extended them upward, they would all meet at a point about a mile above the building. This gives the structure a subtle visual stability, that a perfectly vertical arrangement wouldn't have. Every one of these adjustments is invisible to the naked eye. You look at the Parthenon and you see a perfectly proportioned, perfectly straight building. That's exactly what the architects intended. They introduced systematic imperfections to create the perception of perfection. The Parthenon was built without mortar. The marble blocks were fitted together with such precision that they hold each other in place through sheer craftsmanship. Some of the joins are so tight that a piece of paper cannot be slid between them. It took 15 years to build. It has survived 2,500 years, a conversion to a Christian church, a conversion to a mosque, an explosion when the Venetians used it as a gunpowder magazine in 1687, and systematic looting by Lord Elgin in the early 1800s. It still stands. The Parthenon is not just a beautiful building. It is an argument made in marble that human beings can achieve perfection through reason, craft, and relentless attention to detail. While the Parthenon was being built above the city, something equally remarkable was happening on the slopes of the Acropolis below it. The Theater of Dionysus was the birthplace of Western drama. Every play you have ever seen, every film, every television show, every stage performance traces its ancestry back to the festivals held in this open-air theater in 5th century BCE Athens. The great tragedians of the Golden Age, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, invented dramatic forms that are still being used today. Aeschylus introduced the second actor, making genuine dramatic dialogue possible for the first time. Sophocles added the third actor and refined the tragic form into something capable of extraordinary psychological depth. Euripides pushed the form further still, introducing morally ambiguous characters and questioning the behavior of the gods in ways that made his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable. Sophocles' Oedipus the King is still performed today and is still considered one of the greatest plays ever written. Aristotle called it the perfect tragedy. It tells the story of a man who discovers that in trying to escape his fate, he fulfilled it, that he killed his father and married his mother without knowing it. The horror is not in the violence, but in the recognition, the moment when everything clicks into place and cannot be undone. Aristophanes invented comedy in the same period, sharp, political, obscene, and frequently aimed directly at public figures, including Socrates, who appears as a character in his play The Clouds, suspended in a basket in the air, thinking profound but useless thoughts. The Athenians took theater so seriously that attending the dramatic festivals was considered a civic duty. The city paid for poor citizens to attend. These were not entertainment in the modern sense. They were public rituals that explored what it meant to be human, to suffer, to make choices, to face the gods. But the most influential thinker of the Golden Age never wrote anything down. Not a single word survives in his own hand. Everything we know about him comes from his students, and the city of Athens eventually decided he was so dangerous that they sentenced him to death. His name was Socrates. Socrates was born around 470 BCE and spent his life wandering the marketplaces and gymnasiums of Athens, asking people questions. Not just any questions, questions designed to reveal that the people he was talking to, politicians, generals, craftsmen, poets, didn't actually understand the things they claimed to understand. He would ask a general to define courage, and then, through relentless follow-up questions, show that the general's definition was inconsistent, circular, or simply wrong. He would ask a politician to define justice and demonstrate that the politician had no coherent idea what justice actually was. This was called the Socratic method, and it was deeply, profoundly annoying to the people on the receiving end of it. Socrates himself claimed to know nothing. His famous statement that he was the wisest man in Athens because he alone knew that he knew nothing was not false modesty. It was a philosophical position. Genuine wisdom begins with recognizing the limits of your own knowledge. Most people, he argued, are not even aware of what they don't know. That unawareness is the real ignorance. He attracted a circle of brilliant young men, including Plato, who would go on to found the academy and produce some of the most influential philosophy in history, and Alcibiades, who would go on to cause Athens enormous trouble in ways we'll get to shortly. Socrates questioned everything: the nature of virtue, justice, piety, beauty, knowledge itself. He questioned whether the Athenian democracy was actually producing good governance or just popular governance. He questioned the gods, not by denying them, but by asking what divine approval actually meant. In 399 BCE, at the age of 70, after a lifetime of this, Athens put him on trial. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. He was found guilty by a jury of 501 Athenians and sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. He refused all offers to escape. He drank the hemlock and died surrounded by his students. The execution of Socrates is one of the most troubling moments in Athenian history. A democracy killing its most challenging thinker for the crime of asking inconvenient questions. It is a reminder that democracy, like any system, can turn on the people who push it hardest. While Athens was producing the Parthenon, Sophocles, and Socrates, it was also making enemies. The Athenian Empire, built on the Delian League, was increasingly resented by its allies, who found themselves paying tribute to a city that used their money to build its own monuments and run its own affairs. Sparta, watching Athens grow richer and more powerful, became increasingly alarmed. In 431 BCE, the Peloponnesian War began. Athens and Sparta, the two powers that had together saved Greece from Persia, went to war with each other. It would last 27 years. The war started badly for Athens. Pericles' strategy was to avoid land battle with Sparta's superior army and use Athenian naval power and wealth to outlast them. He brought the population of Attica inside the walls of Athens, letting the Spartans ravage the countryside, while Athens stayed safe behind its long walls connected to the port. Then the plague hit. A devastating epidemic, possibly typhoid fever, possibly something we no longer have a name for, swept through the overcrowded city. Roughly a quarter of the Athenian population died. Pericles himself died of it in 429 BCE, just 2 years into the war. Without Pericles, Athenian democracy produced a series of less capable leaders and increasingly reckless decisions. The worst of these came in 415 BCE, when Athens decided to invade Sicily. The Sicilian expedition was one of the greatest military disasters in ancient history. Athens sent a massive fleet of over 200 ships and 40,000 men to conquer Syracuse, the largest Greek city in Sicily. Alcibiades, Socrates' brilliant, reckless former student, was one of the commanders. He was recalled to Athens on charges before the fleet arrived, defected to Sparta, and spent the next few years causing Athens maximum damage from the outside. The Sicilian expedition ended in total catastrophe. The Athenian fleet was destroyed. The army was captured. Most of the survivors were worked to death in Sicilian stone quarries. Athens lost perhaps 40,000 men and 200 ships in a single disastrous campaign it had voted for in a moment of democratic overconfidence. Athens never fully recovered. The war continued for another decade, but the Sicilian disaster had broken Athenian power. In 404 BCE, Sparta won. Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down. The empire was dissolved. The golden age of Athens lasted roughly 50 years. From the defeat of Persia to the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, Athens was the most creative city that has ever existed. In those 50 years, it produced the Parthenon and the sculptural program that decorated it. It produced the 3 great tragedians and the inventor of comedy. It produced Socrates, who produced Plato, who produced Aristotle, who tutored Alexander the Great. It produced Herodotus, the first historian, and Thucydides, arguably the greatest historian who ever lived. It produced the first serious developments in medicine under Hippocrates, working just off the coast on the island of Kos. It produced democracy. Not perfect democracy, not democracy for everyone, but the working proof that a city could govern itself through the participation of its citizens, rather than the will of a king. Here is what I want you to take away from this. The golden age of Athens happened in a city that was simultaneously running an exploitative empire, engaging in brutal slavery, excluding women from public life entirely, and stumbling toward a catastrophic war of its own making. It was not a perfect society. It was a deeply flawed one. And yet from that flawed, contradictory, brilliant, self-destructive city came ideas that still shape how you think, what you value, and how the society you live in is organized. The tension between Athens' ideals and Athens' reality is not a reason to dismiss what it achieved. It is a reason to take seriously how fragile those achievements are. The city that produced Socrates also killed him. The city that built the Parthenon also destroyed itself through overconfidence and poor democratic decision-making. Genius is not self-sustaining. It requires the right conditions, and those conditions can be lost. Athens lost them, but what it produced in those 50 years proved durable enough to survive the loss. Athens lost the Peloponnesian War. It lost its empire, its walls, and its position as the dominant power in Greece. It never fully recovered its political dominance. But the ideas survived. Plato founded the Academy in 387 BCE, where philosophy would be taught for 900 years. Aristotle studied there before going on to found his own school and tutor a young Macedonian prince named Alexander. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because just as Greece seemed to be exhausting itself in endless internal warfare, a kingdom to the north that most Greeks had always dismissed as semi-barbaric was about to produce the most consequential military commander in history. Next time on Drawn from History, Alexander the Great. The man who conquered the known world before the age of 30 wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, and died at 32 under circumstances that historians are still arguing about today. Until then, this has been Drawn from History. Thanks for watching.